The Nevada sun had turned merciless by noon, baking the desert floor until it shimmered like broken glass. Lila Mae Walsh pressed her back against the weathered fence post, tasting blood from her split lip and feeling the familiar ache of fresh bruises along her ribs. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut from where Cyrus Talbot's knuckles had found their mark that morning. But she kept her good eye fixed on the corral, where the silver Mustang paced like a caged storm. The stallion was magnificent in his fury coat, gleaming like liquid mercury mane, flowing wild and untamed despite weeks of captivity. His hooves struck the hard-packed earth with the rhythm of a war drum, each step a declaration of defiance. But it was his eyes that held her captive. Dark-haunted, filled with the same desperate rage that burned in her own chest. "Ain't seen nothing like it," muttered Jake, the oldest of the ranch hands, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "3 weeks we've been trying to break that devil, and he's put 2 good men in Doc Harrison's care. Tommy's still got his arm in a sling." Lila watched the Mustang rear up his hooves, flashing silver in the brutal light, and felt something twist deep in her stomach. The beast's flanks were crisscrossed with rope burns, his spirit battling against every chain, every fence, every attempt to cage what was born to run free. She knew that fight. Had been fighting it herself for 3 years, ever since her parents died of the fever, and left her nothing but debts and a forged contract that made her a slave in all but name. The Mustang's eyes found hers across the dusty yard, and for a heartbeat the world went silent. In that dark gaze, she saw her own reflection, wild, broken, but not yet defeated. The horse pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, and Lila pressed her bruised palm against the rough wood of the fence rail. "I know." She whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and suffering. "I know exactly how you feel." Behind her, she heard the heavy footsteps of Cyrus Talbot approaching, his spurs ringing against the sun-baked earth, like the tolling of a death bell. She didn't turn around. She'd learned long ago that meeting his eyes only invited more pain, and she'd already paid her quota for the morning. "That beast's been eating my hay for 3 weeks. Cyrus's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Cost me near $50 in feed, and all I got to show for it is a devil horse that won't let a man within 10 feet. Lila remained silent, knowing that any response would only fuel his anger. The Mustang had stopped pacing, his attention fixed on the approaching menace, muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode into violence. "But you got away with horses, don't you, girl?" Cyrus continued his voice, taking on the deceptively casual tone that always preceded his worst cruelties. "Always did have that touch. Maybe that silver devil will listen to you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Lila felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. She'd known this moment would come, had seen it building in Cyrus's eyes for days. The Mustang represented money to him, a fortune if he could be broken, a costly failure if he couldn't. And Lila, she was just another tool in his arsenal, expendable as any other. "Mr. Talbot," she began, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat, "I ain't asking what you think." His hand moved to rest on the worn butt of his Colt .45, the gesture casual but unmistakable. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to get in that corral and you're going to ride that Mustang. If he kills you, well, saves me the cost of feeding you. If you ride him, I'll be rich enough to buy half of Nevada." The Talbot Ranch squatted in the Nevada territory like a festering wound 20 miles from the nearest settlement of Bitter Creek. It was a hard land that bred hard men, where the nearest law was a day's ride away, and justice was whatever a man could enforce with his fists and his gun. Cyrus Talbot had carved out his empire with blood and brutality, his word absolute law, in a domain that stretched from the alkali flats to the pine-covered foothills. The ranch house itself was a testament to his paranoia, built like a fortress with thick adobe walls and narrow windows that could serve as gun ports if needed. Cyrus controlled everything that came and went, every visitor, every piece of mail, every scrap of news from the outside world. He'd made himself king of this desolate realm, and he ruled with the iron fist of a tyrant. Ada Talbot sat on the covered porch, her hands folded in her lap, like a prayer she'd forgotten how to finish. She'd been beautiful once Lila could see it in the delicate bones of her face, the way her graying hair still caught the light. But 30 years of marriage to Cyrus had carved deep lines around her eyes and taught her to move like a woman walking on broken glass. "Please, Cyrus." Ada's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of suppressed terror. "She's just a girl. If that horse kills her, then I'll have one less mouth to feed." Cyrus's laugh was like the rattle of stones in a dry creek bed. "Girl ain't worth the food she eats anyway. Too small for heavy work, too plain to fetch a good price as a wife. But if she can ride that devil horse, she might finally earn her keep." Lila Mae Walsh had arrived at the ranch 3 years ago, a 16-year-old orphan clutching a yellow document that claimed her parents owed Cyrus Talbot $2,000, a fortune that might as well have been $2 million for all her ability to pay it. The fever had taken her parents within months of each other, leaving her alone in a world that had already written her off as cursed. The people of Bitter Creek had whispered about the Walsh family for years. Bad luck followed them like a hungry dog, they said. First, the failed crops, then the livestock that died of mysterious ailments, then the sickness that claimed both parents in one brutal winter. When Cyrus Talbot rode into town with his forged papers and his legal claims, no one questioned his right to collect the debt. A cursed girl was better off as someone else's problem. Now 19. Lila worked from dawn to dusk in conditions that would have broken a stronger person. She cleaned the house, cooked the meals, tended the gardens, and cared for the horses with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the brutality that surrounded her. The animals responded to her touch, when they shied away from everyone else, finding in her something they recognized, a kindred spirit that understood what it meant to be trapped. "I'll do it," Lila said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Cyrus smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Course you will. You don't got a choice." He was right, and they both knew it. In this place, at this time, she was nothing more than property, a debt to be collected, a tool to be used, a problem to be solved. The law wouldn't help her. Hell, the law wouldn't even know she was dead until it was too late to matter. But as she walked toward the corral, Lila felt something stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. It was anger, pure and bright and clean as desert fire. She'd been broken by this man, terrorized and brutalized and reduced to less than human. But she was still breathing, still thinking, still capable of choice, and she chose defiance. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Lila stood at the corral gate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. The silver Mustang had stopped pacing, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Behind her, she could hear the ranch hands gathering Jake and Tommy and the others, their voices a low murmur of anticipation and dread. $5 says the horse kills her before she gets a foot in the stirrup, someone whispered. "Hell, I'll give you 10 says she don't even make it to the horse," another voice replied. Lila blocked out their words, focusing instead on the magnificent animal before her. Up close, the Mustang was even more impressive. 16 hands of pure wildness, scarred but unbroken. His coat shimmered like liquid silver in the harsh light, and his eyes held depths that seemed to go on forever. "Easy, boy," she whispered, stepping into the corral. "I know you're scared. I know you want to run." The Mustang's ears flicked forward, and he took a step toward her, then stopped. His nostrils flared, testing her scent, reading her intentions in ways that went beyond human understanding. Around the corral, The men fell silent, watching in amazement, as the wild stallion that had terrorized them for weeks began to calm. "Why, that's impossible," Jake breathed, his voice barely audible. But Lila felt the truth of it in her bones. The Mustang wasn't just a horse, he was a mirror reflecting back her own desperate need for freedom. When she reached out, slowly, carefully, and touched his muzzle, she felt a connection that went deeper than words, deeper than fear. "They hurt you too," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the desert wind. "But we're both still here. We're both still fighting." The Mustang's breath was warm against her palm, and she saw something in his eyes that made her throat tighten with emotion. Recognition, understanding, hope. She'd named him Silver in her mind, though she'd never spoken the name aloud. Now, looking into those dark eyes, she knew he understood. He wasn't just a horse. He was her salvation, her chance at freedom, her partner in a dance that would either liberate them both or destroy them trying. When she swung onto his back, settling into the natural curve of his spine, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt free. The Mustang moved beneath her like liquid grace, his gait smooth as silk, his power controlled and purposeful. For a moment, Lila forgot where she was, forgot the pain in her ribs and the fear in her heart. She was flying, soaring above the desert floor on wings of silver and starlight. "Well, I'll be damned," Cyrus said, his voice cutting through her reverie like a blade. "Looks like I got myself a gold mine." The words hit her like a physical blow, dragging her back to earth with brutal clarity. She wasn't free, she was still trapped, still owned, still nothing more than a tool for Cyrus's profit. But now, she had something he wanted, something he'd kill to possess, and that made her dangerous. Word spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by traveling merchants and wandering cowboys who'd witnessed the impossible sight of a slip of a girl riding the untamable Mustang. Within days, the story had reached every saloon, every trading post, every lonely ranch house scattered across the Nevada desert. Cyrus Talbot saw dollar signs in those whispers. He penned letters to cattle barons and railroad tycoons, to wealthy ranchers and Eastern investors, promising them a spectacle that would make them forget every other entertainment they'd ever seen. The wild girl and her silver stallion performing for the highest bidder. "We'll tour the whole territory," he told his wife one evening, his voice thick with whiskey and greed. "San Francisco, Sacramento, maybe even back east to New York. Rich folks will pay anything to see something they can't understand." Ada's face went pale in the lamplight. "Cyrus, you can't. She's just a girl, and if something happens, she's my property." He snarled, backhanding her across the face with casual brutality. "Same as that horse, same as you, same as everything else on this ranch. And she'll do what I tell her to do, or she'll wish she had." But Ada's fear ran deeper than her husband's threats. She'd watched Lila with the Mustang, seen something in the girl's eyes that terrified her. It was the look of someone who'd found their purpose, their power, their reason for being. And Ada knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd spent years walking on eggshells, that kind of awakening was dangerous for everyone involved. The next morning, she tried to slip Lila a note warning her of Cyrus's plans, but her husband was watching, always watching. He snatched the paper from her fingers before Lila could read it, his face twisting with rage. What did I tell you about meddling woman?" he hissed, dragging Ada into the house by her hair. Lila heard the sounds that followed Ada's muffled cries, the sickening thud of fists against flesh, Cyrus's voice promising worse punishments if she ever interfered again. When Ada emerged an hour later, her face was a map of bruises, and she wouldn't meet Lila's eyes. That night, Lila lay on her narrow cot in the stable, listening to Silver's restless movements in the adjacent stall. She'd been thinking, planning, measuring distances and possibilities. Cyrus's greed had made him predictable, and predictable men made mistakes. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the Mustang through the wooden slats. Tomorrow we make our choice." Silver nickered softly, as if he understood, and Lila felt a plan crystallizing in her mind. Dangerous, desperate, but maybe their only chance at freedom. The next morning would bring visitors Deputy Burke from Bitter Creek, along with a handful of curious townsfolk who'd heard the stories and wanted to see the spectacle for themselves. Cyrus planned to put on a show to prove his claims and start the bidding war that would make him rich. But Lila had her own plans for the performance. Deputy Samuel Burke arrived at the Talbot Ranch just after dawn, his weathered face grim with the kind of suspicion that came from 20 years of dealing with men like Cyrus Talbot. He'd heard the stories about the orphan girl and the wild Mustang. But something about the whole situation sat wrong in his gut, like bad whiskey. He wasn't alone. A small crowd had followed him from town, shopkeepers and farmers, a few ranch hands from neighboring spreads, even Mrs. Henderson from the general store who'd hitched a ride on Doc Harrison's wagon to witness the spectacle. They gathered in the dusty yard like vultures drawn to carrion, and their faces bright with the kind of excitement that came from watching other people's pain. Cyrus strutted among them like a carnival barker, his voice booming across the desert air. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world. This here girl has accomplished what no man has managed. She's tamed the untamable." Lila stood by the corral gate, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to appear calm. Silver waited inside his coat, gleaming in the morning sun, his eyes alert and intelligent. She'd spent the night whispering to him, sharing her plan in words and touches, and she prayed he understood what was coming. "Now I know some of you might be thinking this is just another horse." Cyrus continued his voice, rising with practiced showmanship. "But let me tell you, this here stallion has put 2 of my best men in the doc's care. He's a killer pure and simple with the heart of a demon and the strength of 10 ordinary horses." Burke's eyes narrowed. The lawman had seen plenty of horse breaking in his time, and he knew the difference between a dangerous animal and a frightened one. Something about this whole setup felt wrong, like a stage play, where everyone knew their lines except him. "Now get in there, girl." Cyrus ordered, his voice carrying the crack of absolute authority. "Show these folks what you can do." Lila took a deep breath and stepped into the corral, her movements slow and deliberate. The crowd pressed closer to the fence, their faces eager with anticipation. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring her worth, judging her value like she was livestock at auction. Silver came to her immediately, his great head lowering to nuzzle her shoulder. She stroked his neck, feeling the power coiled in his muscles, the wildness that still burned in his heart despite weeks of captivity. For several minutes, they performed the routine Cyrus had drilled into them, circles and figure eights, a few simple jumps over low obstacles, demonstrations of the bond between girl and horse. "Magnificent," someone called out from the crowd. Simply magnificent. But Lila's attention wasn't on the spectators. She was watching the gate, measuring distances, calculating angles. The desert stretched beyond the ranch like an ocean of possibility, and somewhere in those vast spaces lay freedom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cyrus was saying, his voice swelling with pride and greed, "what you've just witnessed is the result of weeks of careful training, of patience and skill. That..." Lila's heels pressed into Silver's flanks, and the world exploded into motion. The Mustang launched himself forward like a silver bullet, his hooves thundering against the packed earth. The crowd scattered with cries of alarm as Silver charged the fence, gathering himself for the leap that would carry them to freedom or death. "Stop her!" Cyrus roared, his hand flying to his gun, but it was too late. Silver cleared the fence in a magnificent bound that drew gasps from the crowd, landing in a spray of dust and gravel. His hooves found purchase on the desert floor, and he stretched into a full gallop, his mane streaming behind him like a battle flag. For a few precious seconds, they were free. The wind whipped through Lila's hair, and she felt her heart soar with wild joy. Behind them, she could hear Cyrus screaming orders, the thunder of hoofbeats, as the ranch hands gave chase. But Silver was faster than any of their plodding mounts. The crack of gunfire split the morning air. A bullet whined past her ear close enough to part her hair, and another splintered a fence post as they flashed past. Lila ducked low over Silver's neck, feeling the Mustang's muscles bunch and stretch beneath her as he poured on speed. "Come on, boy," she whispered into his ear. "Show them what freedom looks like." Silver's response was to find another gear, his hooves barely touching the ground as they raced toward the distant canyons. Behind them, the pursuit was falling away, but Lila knew better than to celebrate yet. Cyrus knew this territory like the back of his hand, and he'd find a way to cut them off. She was right. 20 minutes later, she saw dust clouds rising from 3 different directions, and she knew they were being herded like cattle toward some predetermined trap. The desert that had seemed so full of possibility now felt like a cage, its walls closing in with every stride. The chase lasted 2 hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the brutal Nevada landscape. Silver ran like the wind itself, his hooves finding purchase on ground that would have defeated a lesser horse. But Cyrus had split his men and used his knowledge of the terrain to force them into an ever-tightening noose. They were finally cornered in a box canyon, the walls rising like prison bars on 3 sides, and a shallow creek at their backs. Silver's flanks were heaving with exhaustion, his coat dark with sweat, but his eyes still blazed with defiance. Lila slid down from his back, her legs shaking, and pressed her hand against his neck. "You did good, boy," she whispered. "Whatever happens now, you did good." The pursuing riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon like figures from a nightmare. Cyrus sat his horse in the center, his face twisted with rage and satisfaction, his rifle cradled in his arms. Deputy Burke was there too, his expression carefully neutral. But Lila could see the questions in his eyes. "End of the road, girl." Cyrus called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Hope you enjoyed your little ride, because it's going to cost you dear." Lila stood her ground. Silver pressed close to her side and felt something change inside her chest. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else, a cold, clean anger that burned like desert fire. "I'm not your property," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "I'm not your slave. I'm a human being, and I have rights." Cyrus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Rights, girl, you don't have no rights. You're a debt that needs paying, and I'm the man who owns that debt. You belong to me, same as that horse, same as the rocks and the dirt and the air you breathe. Show me the papers," Deputy Burke said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If she's legally bound to you, show me the contract." Cyrus's eyes flicked to the lawman, irritation replacing some of his triumph. "I don't have to show you nothing, Burke. This is ranch business, and you got no jurisdiction here. This is my county." Burke replied evenly, his hand resting on his gun butt. "And when I see a girl being chased by armed men, it becomes my business. Show me the papers." For a moment, something flickered across Cyrus's face, fear, uncertainty, guilt. But then his expression hardened, and he reached into his saddlebags with the confidence of a man who'd planned for this moment. "There's your precious papers," he snarled, pulling out a yellowed document. $2,000 her daddy owed me, plus 3 years' interest. She's mine until every penny's paid, and at the rate she's going, that'll be never. Burke took the papers, his weathered hands careful as he unfolded them. His eyes scanned the document, and Lila held her breath, hoping against hope for a miracle she didn't dare believe in. "Looks legal enough," Burke said finally, and Lila felt her heart sink into her boots. "But I want to examine these more closely. Make sure all the details are in order." "And the details are fine," Cyrus snapped. "Now step aside so I can deal with this thieving little bitch." He raised his rifle, the barrel gleaming in the desert sun, and Lila felt time slow to a crawl. This was it, the moment she'd been running toward all her life. She was going to die in this canyon, and Silver would probably die with her, and Cyrus would go back to his ranch and find some other victim to terrorize. But then Jake's voice cut through the silence like a thunderclap. "That ain't the real contract, Mr. Talbot." Every head turned toward the old ranch hand, who sat his horse at the edge of the group, like a man who just signed his own death warrant. His weathered face was pale but determined, and his hands shook as he pointed at the document in Burke's hands. "Jake." "Cyrus," said his voice deadly quiet. "You better think real careful about what you're saying." But Jake was past the point of caution. He'd spent 3 years watching Lila suffer, 3 years keeping his mouth shut and his head down, and he couldn't do it anymore. "I saw you burn the real papers, Mr. Talbot. Saw you with my own eyes the night after her parents died. You threw them in the fire and said nobody would ever know the difference." The words hit the canyon like a physical blow. Cyrus's face went white, then red, then white again, and his rifle swung toward Jake with deadly intent. "You lying son of a bitch. I ain't lying, and you know it." Jake's voice was steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Her daddy paid that debt before he died. Sold everything he had borrowed from everyone who'd lend to him. The debt was paid, but you burned the receipt and forged new papers." "Why?" Burke demanded, his own weapon now drawn. "Why would you do such a thing?" But it was Ada who answered, her voice carrying across the canyon like a keening wind. She'd been silent since the chase began, sitting her horse like a broken doll, but now she spoke with the clarity of someone who'd finally found her courage. "Because she was alone," Ada said, tears streaming down her bruised face. "Because she was young and scared and had nowhere to go. Because he knew no one would care what happened to a cursed girl with no family, no money, no protection." Cyrus's gun swung toward his wife, but she was beyond fear now, beyond his power to hurt her. "You made me watch while you burned the papers." She continued, her voice rising with each word. "You made me help you forge the new ones. You said if I ever told anyone, you'd kill me. You said—" The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the canyon. But it wasn't Cyrus who fired it, was Deputy Burke, putting a bullet into the air to restore order as the situation spiraled toward chaos. "Everyone calm down," Burke shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Nobody moves, nobody talks until I sort this out." But Cyrus was past the point of reason. Years of absolute power had made him incapable of accepting defeat, and now he saw his empire crumbling around him. With a roar of rage, he brought his rifle to bear on Lila, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If I can't have her, nobody can." Time seemed to fracture into crystalline moments as Cyrus's finger found the trigger. Lila saw the muzzle flash, felt the bullet part the air inches from her head, and threw herself sideways as Silver reared up with a scream of rage. The Mustang's hooves caught Cyrus in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse. But the rancher held onto his rifle and rolled to his feet with the reflexes of a man who'd survived 100 range wars. "Stay down," Burke shouted, but his words were lost in the chaos as horses plunged and men scattered for cover. Lila scrambled behind a boulder, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Silver was between her and Cyrus, his silver coat gleaming like armor, his eyes blazing with protective fury. Blood ran from a shallow groove along his neck where a bullet had grazed him. But he stood his ground like a warrior. 20 years. Cyrus screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. 20 years I've built this ranch, fought for every acre, bled for every dollar. I ain't gonna let some cursed little bitch destroy it all. He fired again, the bullet sparking off the rock beside Lila's head. She could hear Burke shouting orders, could see Jake and the other ranch hands taking cover, but it all seemed distant and unreal. Her world had narrowed to the space between her and the man who'd stolen her life. "You want to know the truth?" Cyrus yelled, advancing on her position with his rifle leveled. "Your daddy was a fool, and your mama was a whore. They deserve to die, and you deserve to join them." Something cold and hard crystallized in Lila's chest at those words. She'd spent 3 years accepting his abuse, 3 years believing she deserved her fate, because she was cursed, because she was worthless, because she was nothing. But in that moment, she understood the truth. She wasn't cursed, she was angry. "My parents were good people," she said, rising from behind the boulder despite the gun pointed at her heart. "They worked hard, they loved each other, and they loved me. They paid their debts and died with honor. You're the one who's cursed, Cyrus Talbot. You're cursed with a black heart and a rotten soul." Cyrus's face twisted with rage, and his finger tightened on the trigger. But before he could fire, Silver struck like silver lightning, his teeth finding the rancher's gun arm and clamping down with bone-crushing force. Cyrus screamed and dropped the rifle, trying to beat the Mustang away with his free hand. But Silver held on with the tenacity of a creature that had found its purpose. "Get him off me!" Cyrus shrieked, but his men were too stunned to move. They'd watched their boss terrorize people for years, and now they were seeing him brought low by the same kind of helpless creature he'd always preyed upon. Deputy Burke moved in with his handcuffs, but Cyrus wasn't finished. With a desperate surge of strength, he broke free from Silver's grip and lunged for the dropped rifle. His fingers had almost closed around the stock when Lila's boot caught him in the ribs, sending him sprawling in the dirt. "You stole my life," she screamed, all her years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "You stole my parents' sacrifice. You made me believe I was nothing, but you're the one who's nothing. You're nothing but a coward who preys on the weak." Cyrus rolled over his face, a mask of blood and fury, but he was finished. Burke was on him in an instant, the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists with a sound like the closing of a coffin lid. "Cyrus Talbot," Burke said formally, "you're under arrest for fraud, kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder." The canyon fell silent except for the sound of Silver's labored breathing and Lila's quiet sobs. She sank to her knees beside the Mustang, her hands gentle as she examined his wounds. The bullet graze was shallow, more blood than damage, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "It's over," she whispered into his ear. "We're free." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Freedom was more than just the absence of chains. It was the presence of choice, of dignity, of the right to determine your own fate. She'd spent 3 years as a slave, and she didn't know if she remembered how to be anything else. "Miss Walsh," Burke said, gently approaching with his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry. I should have looked into your situation years ago. If I'd known, you couldn't have known." Lila replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. He was careful. He made sure nobody would care enough to ask questions. Burke nodded, but she could see the guilt in his eyes. He was a good man who'd failed in his duty, and that failure would haunt him for the rest of his life. "What will you do now?" he asked. Lila looked around the canyon at the men who'd chased her, at the woman who'd finally found her courage, at the broken man who'd stolen her youth. Then she looked at Silver, magnificent and wild and free, and she felt something shift inside her chest. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'll figure it out. We both will." The trial was held in the county seat of Carson City, drawing spectators from across the territory. Cyrus Talbot sat in the defendant's chair with his arm in a sling, his face sullen with defiance, even as the evidence mounted against him. The prosecution had built an ironclad case with testimony from Jake Ada and half a dozen other witnesses who'd finally found the courage to speak. Lila testified on the second day, her voice clear and strong, as she told the court about the years of abuse, the forged documents, the theft of her freedom. She spoke of her parents' love, their sacrifice, and the life that had been stolen from her. When she was finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. "I don't want revenge," she said in response to the prosecutor's final question. I just want people to understand that silence isn't protection, it's complicity. When we see injustice and do nothing, we become part of the problem. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man from San Francisco, did his best to argue that Cyrus had acted within his legal rights, that the debt was real, and the contract valid. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the lies, with the clarity of people who'd lived in small towns long enough to recognize the difference between justice and oppression. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Judge Morrison, a stern man with silver hair and eyes like winter sky, looked down at Cyrus with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Talbot," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have perpetrated a fraud so vile, so calculated in its cruelty, that it shakes my faith in the basic decency of mankind. You stole 3 years of this young woman's life, and you would have stolen more, if not for the courage of those who finally chose to speak." He sentenced Cyrus to 20 years in the territorial prison, a harsh punishment that drew murmurs of approval from the packed courtroom. As the bailiff led him away, Cyrus looked back at Lila with eyes full of impotent rage. "This ain't over, girl," he snarled. "I'll find a way to make you pay." But Lila met his gaze without flinching, and in her eyes he saw something that made his blood run cold. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd terrorized for 3 years. She was something else entirely, something wild and free and utterly beyond his reach. "You already have," she said quietly, "but you'll never hurt anyone again." The months that followed were a time of healing and discovery. Ada Talbot, broken by years of abuse and complicity, sold what remained of the ranch and moved to California to live with her sister. Before she left, she came to Lila with a bank draft for $5,000, every penny she'd received from the sale. "It's not enough." Ada said, her eyes red with tears. "Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what we did to you. But it's all I have." Lila took the money, but her forgiveness came harder. She'd learned that fear and silence were 2 sides of the same coin, and while she understood Ada's terror, she couldn't easily forget the years of suffering that terror had cost her. "I don't hate you," she said finally, "but I can't forgive you yet. Maybe someday, but not now." Ada nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I just hope you can find peace." Deputy Burke, meanwhile, had been elected sheriff by the largest margin in county history. His handling of the Talbot case had earned him the respect and trust of the community, and he used that authority to make changes. He hired new deputies, established regular patrols to isolated ranches, and made it clear that abuse and corruption would no longer be tolerated in his jurisdiction. "No more victims," he told the crowd at his swearing-in ceremony. "No more secrets. Justice doesn't end at the county line, and it doesn't stop when the sun goes down." Jake and the other ranch hands found work on neighboring spreads, their testimony having earned them a measure of respect they'd never known before. Jake, in particular, seemed to carry himself differently, like a man who'd finally learned the difference between loyalty and cowardice. But it was Lila who became the true legend of the territory. She'd used Ada's money to buy a small spread in the foothills close enough to Bitter Creek for supplies, but far enough away for the privacy she craved. She raised horses there, bred them, and trained them with a gentleness that produced results other ranchers couldn't match. Silver, of course, was never broken. He remained wild at heart, responding only to Lila's touch, and together they explored the vast desert spaces that had once been their prison. She learned every canyon, every hidden spring, every secret path through the maze of stone and sand. It was during one of these explorations that she made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a narrow canyon carved into the living rock, she found symbols, ancient markings left by people who'd lived and died in this desert, long before the first white settlers arrived. Among them was a drawing that made her heart race, a woman on horseback, her hair streaming behind her like a banner riding toward a horizon that stretched on forever. "Look at that," she whispered to Silver, her voice filled with wonder. Someone else knew. Someone else understood. The discovery filled her with a sense of connection to something larger than herself, a chain of courage that stretched back through generations. She wasn't the first person to choose freedom over safety, wasn't the first to risk everything for the right to live on her own terms, and she wouldn't be the last. Word of the Silver Girl began to spread through the territory, carried by whispers and rumors that grew with each telling. They said she appeared at night to help travelers who'd lost their way, that she guided lost children back to their families, that she brought water to dying men and hope to the desperate. Lila never confirmed or denied the stories. She simply lived her life, trained her horses, and rode Silver through the desert when the moon was full and the world was quiet. But those who knew her could see the truth in her eyes, the peace that came from living without fear, without lies, without the weight of other people's expectations. She was 22 when the letter arrived, delivered by a nervous young man who'd ridden hard from Carson City. It was addressed to Miss Lila Mae Walsh, Silver Canyon Ranch, and bore the official seal of the territorial government. Inside was a formal document, heavy with legal language and official stamps. It was a pardon signed by the territorial governor himself, officially clearing her of any debt to the Talbot estate. But more than that, it was a recognition, an acknowledgement that what had been done to her was wrong, that the system had failed her, and that she deserved better. At the bottom, in the governor's own handwriting, was a personal note. "Your courage in speaking truth to power has inspired us all. May you use your freedom well." Lila folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her saddlebags. Then she walked out to the corral, where Silver waited, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, his eyes bright with intelligence and love. "What do you think, old friend?" she asked, stroking his neck. "Ready for another adventure?" Silver whickered softly and nuzzled her shoulder, and Lila felt her heart swell with contentment. She'd found her freedom, earned it through pain and courage, and the willingness to speak truth even when it was dangerous. She'd found her peace in the wide desert spaces in the company of the Mustang, who'd shared her captivity and her liberation. But most importantly, she'd found herself. Not the broken girl who'd been terrorized by Cyrus Talbot, but the woman who'd risen from that brokenness stronger and wiser than before. She'd learned that freedom wasn't just about escaping your chains. It was about refusing to let those chains define you. The sun was setting over the Nevada territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, when Lila Mae Walsh swung onto Silver's back and rode out into the desert. Behind her, the lights of Bitter Creek twinkled in the gathering dusk, a community that had learned to value courage over comfort, truth over silence. She was free, she was whole, she was home. And in the distance, carried on the evening wind, came the sound of hoofbeats, a rhythm like a heartbeat, steady and strong and unafraid. It was the sound of hope, of possibility of a future that belonged to her and her alone. The legend would grow, passed down through generations of desert wanderers and frontier families. They would speak of the Silver Girl, the woman who'd refused to be broken, who'd chosen freedom over safety and truth over lies. They would tell their children about the bond between a girl and a Mustang, about the courage it took to stand up to cruelty, about the price and the value of true freedom. But for Lila Mae Walsh, the legend was less important than the reality. She had Silver, she had her ranch, she had the endless desert that had become her sanctuary. She had the satisfaction of knowing that Cyrus Talbot would spend the rest of his life in a cage, that Ada had found some measure of peace, that Jake and the others had learned to speak truth instead of hiding in fearful silence. Most of all, she had the knowledge that she'd never again be anyone's property, anyone's victim, anyone's broken thing. She was her own woman, living by her own rules, accountable only to herself and the Mustang who'd chosen to share her journey. Years would pass, and the territory would change. Towns would grow, railroads would come, and the wild frontier would gradually give way to civilization. But the desert would remain vast and eternal and free, and those who knew where to look could still sometimes see her, a woman on a silver horse riding the horizon like a prayer made manifest. Lila Mae Walsh lived to be 78, her final years spent in the cabin she'd built with her own hands, surrounded by the horses she'd raised and the people she'd helped. When she died peacefully in her sleep, Sheriff Burke, ancient now, but still sharp, spoke at her funeral. She taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. It's the choice to do what's right, despite the fear. She showed us that freedom isn't something you're given, it's something you take, something you fight for, something you protect every single day. They buried her beside Silver, as she'd requested, on the hill overlooking the desert she'd called home. The headstone was simple. Lila Mae Walsh, she chose freedom. But the true monument to her life wasn't carved in stone. It lived in the Silver Canyon Ranch, which continued to serve as a sanctuary for the lost and broken. It lived in the stories that passed from one generation to the next, tales of courage and redemption that inspired others to find their own strength. It lived in the desert itself, where the wind still carried the echo of hoofbeats and the promise that freedom was always possible for those brave enough to claim it. The Silver Girl was gone, but her spirit remained a reminder that even in the harshest landscape, hope could flourish, that even the most broken things could heal, and that the human spirit, no matter how battered, could always choose to rise. In the end, that was her greatest victory. Not the money she'd recovered or the justice she'd won, but the simple, profound truth that she'd lived by her own choice, on her own terms, with her own wild, unbreakable heart, free at last and free forever in the boundless desert she'd chosen as her home.